the motion before us stands that this House would partition Iraq. Now before we get on with the debate, let us look at some key terms in the motion. First of all, the word partition. By this word, we, the proposition, are saying that we would completely separate Iraq into 3 sovereign states. Iraq refers to a sovereign state in the Middle East who at present moment is being ravaged by war after the US occupation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to move on to my case division. I today, as the first speaker of the proposition, actually talking firstly on status quo, secondly on the policy details, and thirdly on the most pressing need of this policy. My second speaker today will be talking to you all on the benefits on the social, political, and economic level of this policy. And my third speaker will further the case. Now, ladies and gentlemen, today the proposition believes that we should partition Iraq. No, thank you, ma'am. Because then we would be able to bring about peace and stability to this war-torn region of the Middle East. Now, ladies and gentlemen, today, now let's look at the status quo of Iraq. The war in Iraq started 2003. Not soon after, American forces and other NATO forces managed to overthrow Saddam in a matter of months. After that, however, situations have not been so good. First of all, the ethnic divisions between the Shia and the Sunnis have become obvious. The sectarian violence has increased year after year, no thank you sir, year after year in Iraq. Millions have been killed because of this violence, which often results in acts of terrorism. Economic revenue from the oil fields have also been at a low. Repeated attacks in the oil fields, no thank you sir, has resulted in very detrimental effects. Apart from that, the fact that Iraq is such an unstable region, the fact that there is an imminent threat of civil war, has made investors even more afraid to invest in the country and go in and set up new businesses.
Yes, sir.
So far, no thank you sir, so far what we see is in the economic side, it's also not so good. And apart from that, the main government housed in Baghdad, ladies and gentlemen, it holds little power all over Iraq. Its powers start and may possibly end in Baghdad. The sectarian violence, no thank you sir, sectarian violence has given huge power to clerics outside Baghdad, clerics which the government, no thank you ma'am, which the government cannot control, such as Muqtada al-Sadr, who have much authority and even their own armies. However, what we see is that because of this, innocent civilians, ladies and gentlemen, women, children and men, they are caught in the crossfire. And almost every single day, we see news of more repeated deaths in Iraq. No thank you sir. So now, having dealt with the severity of the situation, the fact that there is something seriously wrong in Iraq, let me now present to you our policy which will solve this problem. First of all, the proposition today, we are saying that we split Iraq into 3 sovereign states, comprising the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites in their own predominant territories. Any areas which the Kurdistans are majority, we make a no thank you ma'am. We put them in that area alongside other Kurds from other places of Iraq. Who will oversee this huge program? Yes, sir.
In fact, by allowing these minorities to remain within your states of Sunni, Shia, and Kurds, you're allowing these minorities to be pressed within these individual states and therefore worsening the ethnic tension.
Point taken, sir, but obviously what you do not realize is that we are saying that there will be 3 sovereign states in which each state will be split according to the race. So that means in Kurdistan there will be only Kurds, in the Sunni area there will be only Sunnis, and in the Shia area there will be only Shiites. So the area, no, thank you, sir. Obviously, there will be no chance of an ethnic division when the 3 sovereign states have been split up, because then they'll be more worried about how they get on their feet as a state. So the implementation of this policy will be seen by the United Nations and help from other major powers around the world. For each of the 3 separate states, leaders from each ethnic group, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites, will be elected to represent their own states and hold power and come up with policies. There will be a body to regulate the division of the resources to help all 3 states get back on their feet. By this, we are talking mainly on the oil fields in Iraq, which are concentrated in the northern side of Iraq. So there will be a body, ladies and gentlemen, to help regulate this flow of revenue so that each and every member state, so each of the 3 sovereign states get the equal share of the revenue. Case in point, ladies and gentlemen, with the separation of Iran from India and Pakistan. When these two states were separated, India did help Pakistan send over revenue, send over aid to help this state get back on the feet. This is the classic example of when we see a nation in which there's ethnic warfare between, thank you sir, between the Hindus and the Muslims. Partition does work, and that's why we're also saying that we put in a body to regulate this division of resources. To help share the economic division, each of the different states will be allowed, will be given equal opportunity to share in the revenue. And also, there will be help given from the United Nations financially and economically to each of the states to help them get back on their feet economically, politically, and socially. And also, there will be a UN presence in all three nations to stop the possible rise of conflict between the three. Apart from that, ladies and gentlemen, the sharing of the oil revenue is crucial. There will be a dialogue held. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, if you want equal resources to be distributed to these three states, we see that in the status quo, we see that the majority are Shiite. Therefore, how are you going to get equal resources distributed to these countries?
The point is, we are going to be holding a dialogue to make sure each state gets each share of the equal share of the oil revenue in proportion. And apart from that, it's not the three themselves who will be having a dialogue. We are saying bring in other international organizations, the United Nations, which hold enormous power and who do not have any outside agendas of their own. So by this way, we'll be thank you. And so in this way, we will be helping each three states get the equal share of this enormous oil revenue to help them get on their feet. Now, ladies and gentlemen, also my point on the pressing need. As I've already stated, sectarian violence has increased day after day. Weapons inflow from Iraq has been huge. In this way, militants from the Shia and the Sunni region, they have been gaining weapons. And each day follows, they get more and more powerful. And whatever attempts so far done by the US, for example, the surge, has so far been unsuccessful. So therefore, this escalating violence has a very real chance of turning out into a full-blown civil war, which would be extremely detrimental to the entire region. So by separating these three states, we are stopping the ethnic groups inside Iraq from fighting each other, from basically bringing the country down. So as each three states, they will have their own resources, they will be able to get back on their feet, and there will be no more ethnic conflict. So ladies and gentlemen, today, let us take the step forward. Let us stop this senseless killing. Let us help save the people of Iraq, and therefore go with outside of the house.
When India and Pakistan were separated, Mahatma Gandhi cried, saying that he lost his own brother. And that is exactly what the proposition is proposing today. And we cannot allow Iraq to be partially partitioned. But before I move on to my own case, let me show you what went wrong with their case's two main intentions. Firstly, on their entire policy of how they would carry out their separation. Secondly, on their pressing need and how this policy is actually going to solve the problem. Firstly, let me deal with their policy. They told us that the UN and a body would facilitate the partition of Iraq. But let us consider the problems there. Firstly, the UN is stressed out all over the world. It cannot allocate its resources properly in Iraq. Moreover, the UN and the body that they are talking about do not know of the intricate conditions in Iraq and the problems in Iraq that is going on at this point of time. Therefore, their partition will not be able to take place. Moreover, how are they going to draw the line? They have not provided any particular mechanism as to how they are going to draw the line. What will be the standards of drawing such lines? And if they are actually proposing that every single ethnic group to be separated from each other, that is simply impossible because each and every ethnic group is mixed together in society. Therefore, partitioning them according to different ethnic groups is simply impossible. Something I will talk about later in my case as well. Secondly, how will their resources be allocated? Is because most of the oil fields in Iraq are essentially located in the west. So if you partition, how will you divide the oil fields equally among the three separate sovereign states that they are talking about? It is again unfeasible and unfair. Moreover, we have to understand that the ultimate goal of the partition, even that side of the house understands, is the healing of wounds, which means that ultimately there should be unification. which means that once they partition Iraq, it is impossible for us to unify Iraq. It is impossible to actually gain this healing of wounds, and therefore their entire policy of partition falls. Now let me deal with the second main contention of the pressing needs. Fine, we understand that Iraq is in a state of problem now, but will the partition of Iraq actually solve the problem? That is the motion that we have to understand today. We have to understand that this problem will not be solved because these ethnic groups, the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds, cannot completely be separated from each other because of the presence of minorities. Now, even if their policies somehow works and all these sovereign states are separated from each other, it will not work because these Sunnis and Shiites will now be not able to mingle with each other. They have a culture of hate incorporated within them. What will happen is that these people now will want to fight against the other ethnic groups in the different states, and therefore their partition no longer works. And having dealt with their constructive completely, let me now move on to my case divide. I, as the first speaker of the opposition, will be talking about how this policy of partitioning Iraq will actually exacerbate racial and religious tensions. I will also be talking about how there will be an extremely large disparity between the separate states. While my second speaker will be talking about how it actually creates a regional theater of war, and also how it causes more the spurring of extremism in this region. Now, moving on to my point, I will show you how this policy fails both in the short term as well as in the long term. First, on how this policy will actually exacerbate racial and religious tension. Let's look at the short term first. They propose a policy in which we would partition Iraq. Now, we have to consider a lot of things while partitioning Iraq. When these Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds are actually partitioned from each other, they will want to fight over land. They want their new nation to have more space, more resources, and this is why this policy of partitioning Iraq will actually plunge Iraq into even more civil war than what it is now. Because the very fact that these Sunnis and Shiites are going to fight against each other to acquire the best possible land within that small region of turbulence, that is why this policy hold on a minute, sir. This policy of partitioning Iraq actually fails in the short term. Don't you agree, sir?
As we already stated, that each state will be separated into their own sovereign state, so there is no chance of an ethnic conflict between the three states.
Sir, we have already shown you how the separation into three sovereign states with each and every individual race in each of these states is impossible because of the minorities that are present in each of these groups. And if you're actually proposing, you're uprooting the family roots from each and every region and transferring it to another, which is simply not feasible in your case. Now, having dealt with that, let me move on back to my case. Let's look at what happened between India and Pakistan when it initially separated. What happened is that the Hindus and the Muslims went into war. There were severe border conflicts within that region of India and Pakistan as to which country should acquire Kashmir, which country should not acquire Kashmir, and that problem results even today. And this is the problem that will happen when you partition Iraq. They will fight for resources, they will fight for land, and that is why we cannot allow this to happen in the short term. Let us now look at the long term. What essentially they are proposing is to create 2 or 3 rival states against each other, because each of these races are actually extremely, they have extreme amounts of hate against each other. So when you essentially separate these states, what you're causing is that you're basically ensuring that each of these different races are in 3 different racial states. Racial and hate, the states which hate each other. And this is a problem. Because what will happen is that there's no longer any mingling of these races anymore. So, generation after generation, a culture of hate is created, in which, let us take the example of a Sunni state, for example. The Sunni father will tell the Sunni children that Shiites are bad, Kurds are bad. This is exactly what is the problem, because this generation after generation of hate will increase after these states are completely separated from each other. Because there is no form of mingling between each other. There is no forms in which Shiites and Sunnis can actually come together in a unified Iraq and talk to each other. And this is a problem in the long term, and that is why we cannot separate the partition of Iraq. Now let me move on about the large disparity between the states that will be created. Let's look at the short term again. We have to understand that because of Saddam's suppression, the Sunnis are the people in Iraq who are richer, more educated. The Shiites, who are the majority population in Iraq, do not have as much of education, do not have the riches, neither do the Kurds. Now when you separate these states, what will happen is that one state will have all the rich people with all the education, whereas the other states, such as the Shiites and the Kurds, will suffer tremendously. And this is not a way in which you want to start off a new nation, as they are proposing, because they are starting off on clearly unlevel grounds, clearly grounds which cannot be reformed anymore. Moreover, let us now look at the long-term detriments. We have to understand that Iraq's economy is mostly dependent on oil. And when you're actually separating each of these states into three different communities, you cannot definitely ensure the equal distribution of oil in the first place. Now, those regions that actually get the lesser amount of oil will suffer tremendously because now their economies can no longer stand on their own. Because these countries cannot access the oil supplied to other nations or for themselves anymore. And because of the culture of hate that I talked about in the three different sovereign states, this problem will even more be exacerbated in which these states will not even be willing to share the oil in the first place. And that is why we cannot allow the partition of Iraq, because it exacerbates racial tension, it causes tremendous disparity between the states, and therefore this portion must fall.
Very good afternoon, members of the House. Before moving on to my substantive topic, there are several points of contention that I have with the opposition case. Clearly, they've not been listening to what my first speaker has been saying. They came up and told us, firstly, about how by partitioning Iraq, we are displacing the people all over Iraq. But what we are saying is that the people are already geographically partitioned, and moreover, these minority, and so they say, will also be given the chance for them to actually move into an area whereby they feel most comfortable. Therefore, we're not forcing them to actually stay in the area where they are supposed to stay. Also, they came up and told us about resource allocation, how it be unequal. But what we tell you is that resource allocation, it will be proportional to the number of people in that particular state. We tell you, we will be dividing the revenue, as my first speaker has already mentioned. There will be a body overseeing this whole process, and by doing so, they will actually be allocating the revenue and resources accordingly and proportionately. Moreover, what they also came up and told us, ladies and gentlemen, by partitioning Iraq, there will be hate, because a father will tell his son that, no, son, you are a Shiite Muslim, you shouldn't be mingling around with Sunni Muslim. Ladies and gentlemen, what exactly is happening now in society? Isn't this the exact case of what's happening currently in status quo? We tell you, no thank you ma'am. What we tell you is that the hate already exists. So what does the opposition propose? Do they propose that we stay the way we are, especially in status quo, and encourage violence to go on as it is? Or, members of the House, do we go with a proposition stand as to do what is better for society? Because what we understand is that utopia cannot be achieved under whichever policy, but we tell you, through our policy, there will be progress made, and progress has to be from a step by step, and we tell you, a step will be better than sitting back and doing nothing and ignoring problems that we see currently in status quo, which would totally be the wrong way to go in today's debate. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, they also told us about how Iraq is economically dependent on oil. However, what we are saying is that once again, there will be proportional distribution in these sovereign states. As my first speaker has already mentioned, there will be a body that will be sitting down. No, thank you, sir. There will be a body that will be sitting down and coming together, a representative of these three states, and they will be holding talks, whereby ensuring this fairer and more proportional distribution. Now, having dealt with the pillars of the opposition's case, allow me to move on to my substantive. Today, I, as a second speaker, will be talking about, firstly, how by partitioning Iraq, we will see greater social stability, and secondly, how they would also lead to economic stability. Firstly, on the point of social stability, what we can see, ladies and gentlemen, is Iraq being torn apart by violence. Millions of innocent people are losing their lives because of the incompetence of the state. Now, what we are seeing is that the Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds Muslims, they are fighting. What we have to do, ladies and gentlemen, is stop this escalation of conflict. We have to take a step to prevent this conflict from escalating into greater harm. And we tell you this can effectively be done through our policy, unlike the opposition, where what they are doing is just sitting back and going with status quo. What we are seeing, what will also happen, ladies and gentlemen, is that internal peace and stability is also being stemmed in society in Iraq. And we tell you, through our policy, we will actually be taking the more progressive step in solving this problem. Now, through partitioning, ladies and gentlemen, there will be various benefits to society as a whole. Firstly, on that of land. What we can see is that currently the Kurds Muslims do not have
Point of
land.
information, madam.
Yes, sir.
What we are essentially saying is that when you partition, you're actually creating a culture of hate in which
Yes,
people
sir.
will
As
fight
I
against each
already
other.
mentioned, it's nothing new for the people to be fighting because these people are already fighting. So what we are saying is that what we are trying to do is segregate them, ladies and gentlemen, to prevent further fighting, because we understand that fighting cannot be stopped with, just at one go, but what we are doing is doing it one at a time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the main focus should be partition them. Other aims of preventing such conflicts will come at a later step. However, today's debate rather focuses on what we can do at best at the short term for Iraq, and this is what we are proposing today. Now, as I was mentioning, ladies and gentlemen, these Kurds do not have the land. What they are doing is that millions of Kurds are displaced, and many of them are running to refugee camps in Turkey. Now, what is happening now, ladies and gentlemen, is that by giving these Kurds, what is happening now is that these Kurds are running to refugee camps, and also what Turkey is also seeing is also a problem of terrorism by these Kurdish militants. Now, what we show you, or what we propose, is that by actually allocating through partitioning Iraq, by allocating land for Iraq, we tell you they will be given their own land. There wouldn't be a problem of thousands of Kurds running over to Turkey. Moreover, what we'd also see was that these Iraqis would also be given a right to elect their own leaders, because currently, ladies and gentlemen, the Kurds have no representation. We tell you this could be all the more reason for such a conflict to happen in the first place. However, by partitioning Iraq, what we are doing is we are ensuring sovereign states for each particular state, and what we have shown you is that this will be more beneficial because these Kurds will have a voice and will have a representative. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, the probability of violence will be drastically reduced. As I mentioned earlier, we are not moving towards utopia, but what we are doing is taking a more progressive step to tackle the root of the problem. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, what we can see is that currently, yes, no, thank you, ma'am. What we can see is that there are also various cultural and religious differences that are inherent in Iraq today. And what we are saying is that the propensity for violence is already being manifested. What we see is that when a Sunni Muslim bombs a Shiite Muslim's mosque, the reverse takes place as well. Now, what we have also shown you is that by actually partitioning these states, there will be lesser violence for the time being, ladies and gentlemen. And this is what we want. What we want to do is a cool-off period. We want to separate these Muslims such that there will be lesser violence and conflict and tension between these people. Now, onto my second prong, on that of the economic stability. What we can see now is that the reason why Iraq is in such a dire state is also because of the reason that it is not economically stable, despite having the resources that it has. During the dictatorship, ladies and gentlemen, when Iraq was affluent, under the rule of Saddam Hussein, but what we can see now, that in an attempt to become a unified Iraq, this has actually resulted in chaos. And what we are doing is we are trying to reduce, yes sir.
When you actually partition Iraq, that economic stability will come far worse because now the resources are not allocated equally.
Members of the House, once again, we have already told you, what we are doing is we're getting a body to come together and ensure that the resources and revenue are proportionately divided. So in what way are they going to be economically unstable? Moreover, even if they were going to be economically unstable, as the opposition puts it, we tell you they'll be more stable as they are now, compared to what they are now. And that is the main aim of the proposition, to progress these Iraqis from a dire state that they are now. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, what we can also see that there are various problems in terms of in the economic arena. For example, what we see is that currently these Shiites and Sunni Muslims, they're being discriminated against in areas that are predominant by a particular Muslim religion. What we tell you, by actually partitioning Iraq, we tell you there will be a lesser degree of such discrimination, and also these people would actually enjoy various benefits, and together as a sovereign state, ladies and gentlemen, we would see a sovereign state benefiting compared to how stagnant they are now. And that is what the proposition is pushing for today, ladies and gentlemen, progress. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what we have been showing you today, we have shown you that firstly, by actually partitioning Iraq, there will actually be greater social stability because there will be a cool-off period for these Muslims whereby they will be segregated. And that is what we are hoping for, and that is what the proposition is pushing for today. Moreover, what we have also shown you that there will be greater economic stability. And therefore, because of the various benefits that we can see through partition, and currently we do not see any benefits brought about by the opposition side, go with my side of the house. Thank you.
Thinks that partitioning of Iraq is like playing with Play-Doh, because they think that policy will work effectively. They think it's so easy to separate the sovereign state just like that. But just a snap of the finger, they think We say no. And today I'll be dealing with their side of the house in 3 main points. First, their policy, secondly, social stability, and thirdly, economic stability. Let's first deal with the policy. Today we talk to us about how in the current status quo, these Kurds, Shiite, and Sunnis are already partitioned in Iraq. They are already partitioned geographically. But we say no. Instead, most of the Sunnis and Shiite actually live together in the very same place. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we say that the Sunnis and Shiite are already living in the same place and it's impossible to differentiate them in the current status quo. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we say that their policy will not work because it's impossible to divide geographically. Secondly, we talk to us about how to divide the resources more effectively. Firstly, we say that it's impossible to shift your permanent oil fields in this country. And we say, no, thank you, madam. We say that because it's impossible, we say that one race will actually get the monopoly of the oil fields, and that will result in more violence because now you have the resentment of the other sectors of society against this particular sovereign state. Also, to talk about how we are going to hold talks and we're going to have a board and governing everything. But ladies and gentlemen, this is really feasible. We say that because of this entrenched tension in Iraq now, we say that how is it possible to bring everybody together to have negotiations? We say that because if it was so possible, we will already have negotiations in Iraq already. And therefore we say that because this is impossible, also we talk to the example about how the Shiites in the end would have more resources compared to the Sunnis and the Kurds because they just have more people. The whole idea of proportionality. We say that because now Shiites would have more resources, more oil fields, in the end what is going to happen is that the Sunnis and the Kurds will not be happy, and in the end they are going to vote against the Shiites. Thank you, madam. And hence their policy will not occur, and it is not practical in principle. It's going to cause even more problems. Let's talk about the second point, the social stability. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is very clear to see the first and second speaker to be talking about the same issue today. But anyway, I'll deal with the social stability once again. Because today, what they are doing is that you're not going to have a progressive policy or progressive society. Instead, you're going to have a regressive one. Why so? Because now you're actually splitting up the society into more segregating even more. And what happens is that they say that the hate is already existing. They said, yes, we understand that the hate already exists. But by segregating them, what you're doing is that you're actually solidifying all these tensions, and the government is actually recognizing that all these tensions occur and solidifying the tensions. Yes, sir.
But as we've already seen, even by keeping them together, tensions are getting worse and worse day after day.
We understand that keeping them together may not be the very best solution, but we say that separating them will even cause even more violence because now, thank you, madam, because now what you're going to do is that you're going to increase more tensions between the states, and now, ladies and gentlemen, we say that this is not the way to go. Also, they talk to us about how the hate already exists, but we say it will be exacerbated in the current status quo when you solidify the tensions. Then, ladies and gentlemen, they brought us about refugees in Turkey. Well, we say that we understand the situation is very bad now, but your policy is not going to make the situation better. Because thank you, madam. Because what you're doing is that you're separating these people into 3 sovereign states. What happens is that no matter what, there are still going to be some minorities covered in the Shiite state. For example, the Sunnis, some Sunni families will meet in the Shiite state. And what happens is that when they actually deflect, they are actually going to result in even more violence and tensions in the borders, and this is not what we want in society, and therefore their social stability is gone. Then let's talk about the third point, economic stability. All they told us is that using their policy and saying that we'll have more stability, economic stability, just because we're all going to share the resources. We said that firstly, when your social stability is not there, your economic stability will not come about. Secondly, when you're dividing the resources, dividing them into 3 sovereign states, what happens is that these states no longer have the same resources to be able to work with. And therefore, they are going to be in a weaker position to even deal with the economy. And therefore, the economy, thank you, sir, will be even more unstable when they are actually separated in 3 sovereign states. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, having done that, because there's no economic stability or social stability, and their policy for, let me move on to my case. I'll be talking to you about 2 main points. Firstly, creating a regional theatre of war, and secondly, spurring more extremism. Let's deal with the first point, creating a regional theatre of war. In the status quo, there are many groups in society, Kurds, Shiites, and the Sunnis. And what happens in the world today, certain countries actually back them up because of the commonalities, because of the common ground, because they all have the different sectors, different religion sects. For example, Iran actually supports the Shiites, and the Saudi Arabians actually support the Sunnis. And this is because Iran and Saudi Arabia wants to prop up and support the Sunnis and Shia respectively in the country itself. And therefore we see that these countries already have a vested interest in these certain groups in Iraq. And what they're going to do is that going to spur even more tensions. Thank you, madam. We see that Iran has been sending revolutionary guards and military units in Iraq already. And the US have proven that because they have found Iranian spies in Iraq. And therefore, when you actually partition Iraq, what you're doing is you're creating more interest for Iran and Saudi Arabia to intervene. Why so? Well, we talk about the superpowers intervening. That is your superpower, intervening. And therefore, you will create even more conflict and even more war. Because what happens is that when you draw in these bigger powers within the region, in the Middle East, this worsens the conflict. Because why? Now you're exacerbating the local conflict to a regional conflict, ladies and gentlemen. And that is not what we want in Iraq. We want to protect the lives of the citizens. Yes, sir.
But as we already see, the vested interest that all of these countries have is to create a much more stable Iraq.
Thank
so
you,
if
sir.
they do want to.
Well, we understand the vested interest of these people. And we recognize that because of this vested interest, they are going to come into Iraq and even split it out a more worsening tension. We take a parallel example of Vietnam, who was partitioned to North and South. And ultimately, due to similar ideologies, North Vietnam was supported by USSR and South by US. And what happens is it created the clash of superpower rivalry, and the locals were caught in the crossfire between the battle of superpowers. And this is exactly what happened when we actually partitioned Iraq. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we do not want to partition Iraq because all it does is that it fuels even more regional conflict. Let's deal with the second point, spurring more extremism. Due to different groups of society, what happens is that in every sector there exists fanatics and radicals within the scene. And what happens is that we want to destroy the other group because firstly, they feel they're more superior, and secondly, they feel threatened by the other group in society. We take the example of al-Sadr, who actually preaches to the civilians as he's a radical Shiite plan to kill US and kill the Sunnis in Iraq. And therefore, because of the very existence of these people, what you're doing with the partition Iraq is that you're solidifying the racial religious tensions within the society. What you're doing, you're enticing more terrorist cause. Because partitioning would spur more terrorism. Because now these fanatics know exactly where the concentration lies, where the greatest concentration of the enemy group lies. And this is going to result in more conflict because now they are going to go to the country and they know exactly where to bomb. And therefore, this will lead to the loss of life. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, because we do not want to spur more terrorism, because we do not want the most instability in society, we say we want to protect lives and we do not want to partition Iraq.
Third proposition speaker will show you how all the points of contention or all the problems that the opposition has shown with our policy today do not actually stand, and how our policy is the best way to solve the problems in Iraq today, unlike no other policy proposed by the opposition who wishes to allow the tensions to continue as they are. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have three main points of contention with the opposition today. Firstly, as to that of the resource allocation. Secondly, as to that of the social and economic stability within the region. And thirdly, as to the culture of hate that might be created or that is already existing in that region. Now, ladies and gentlemen, moving on to my first point of contention as to the idea of resource allocation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition today is not totally illogical or not pragmatic. Yes, we understand that all fields are natural resources, and to say that, okay, you get a barrel of oil, you get a barrel of oil, and you get a barrel of oil is not possible. We totally understand that, and that is the reason why in the speech of my first proposition speaker already told you that precisely because natural resources are not something you can divide within the three states, we shall divide the revenues within the three states. And how shall this be done? As my first proposition speaker has told you, a party shall be created consisting of members from all the three states. This will ensure that the state which is nearer these oil fields does not exploit the natural resources that it has gained, or the other states are not left out. This will ensure transparency and benefit for all the regions. Yes, we understand that there might be a conflict, and therefore, to prevent this conflict in the future, to prevent the nations from fighting amongst themselves and for the natural resources, the UN and the US or other nations would be overlooking the transfer process. And ladies and gentlemen, therefore we understand that by dividing these resources proportionately, looking at the population and the area of these people and the three states, we can solve the problems of resource allocation in the future. By merely saying that yes, they might fight for it and let us not do it, let us just drop this whole idea of the partition is merely ridiculous. Now let us look at the question of examples of North Korea and South Korea, ladies and gentlemen. When the two states divided, even today, South Korea gives some technological help, etc. to North Korea, and vice versa. In the case of division of India and Pakistan, millions of rupees were given to the Pakistan state to ensure that, since we know that differences exist, since we know that the Muslims in Pakistan are a little backward and the society has not gained as many benefits as the Indian society, money was given by the consent of both the members, both the leaders of both the nations. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what we have seen that the whole process or the whole problem of resource allocation can be solved by diplomatic talks, etc., between the leaders of these factions and leaders from the international arena. Now, ladies and gentlemen, moving on to my second point as to that of social stability and the economic stability. What has the opposition today told you over and over again? A culture of hate will be created. A culture of hate will be created. But ladies and gentlemen, don't we already see the culture of hate existing? No, thank you, ma'am. So we say, okay, the culture of hate will be exacerbated in the future by dividing them and regional wars will conflict. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us see what is good. By allowing the Sunnis, Shias and Kurds, who obviously have ideological difference, who already cannot stand the sight of each other and are out to take their necks, ladies and gentlemen, by putting them in different nations so that each can work for their own prosperity, we are allowing them and we are giving them space so that they can move forward. We are removing the whole idea or the possibility of conflict between them. Yes, we agree that since there are shared boundaries, conflict may ensue and therefore a no man's land or a military will be placed on the borders as is there for any other partition. Now, on to the second point as to the vested interest of the surrounding nations into these, countries. Now, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, pragmatically, none of the surrounding nations would want wars between three nations because that would mean instability for the whole region. It would mean economic backwardness for the whole region because war is such a thing which affects. Yes, sir.
Even Iran has moved into Iraq right now to actually support the Shiites.
Precisely, sir. If the nation itself was separated, Iraq can definitely go out to support the Shia nation to move ahead as a community. What we presently see is that these vested interests cause these communities to fight among themselves and has caused the nation to plunge into civil war. And therefore, by giving them a separate state, by giving them a separate space, we allow, yes, we agree there might be alliances between these nations, but precisely, so these alliances will work for a better purpose, they will work for the benefit of the progress of the nations rather than creating a split within the region which will in the end cause harm to one and all the nations present in that region. And so this whole idea of the possibility of region conflicts and the possibility of region wars certainly does not hold because, ladies and gentlemen, logically giving them a separate state would mean peace and stability in the best interest of all the nations involved. Next, secondly, the whole idea about radicalism existing in the region. Now, ladies and gentlemen, don't we already see radicalism in the region? Don't we see terrorists who are out to be out? No, thank you, ma'am. We already see that there are so many suicide bombers out there blowing up cars and children and everyone's life is being lost. Yes, radicalism will exist in the future, but how will that affect all the three nations? No, thank you, sir. Yes, there might be people with political interest who might want to create conflict, but ladies and gentlemen, it will definitely be lesser than what is existing today with so many terrorist attacks and instability in the region with everyone involved. Yes, as we have already told you, we are not aiming for utopia. We accept being pragmatic people, that is nearly impossible, and that some amount of conflict or violence will remain in the region, and therefore we have put forces into place to ensure that stability states. But ladies and gentlemen, just do nothing about it and to watch people die every day is sheerly cowardice. Since we're not willing to take the risk, since we are afraid of the so-called possible problems that might crop up, and therefore we sit back, is merely cowardice.
Madam,
yes, sir.
The partition will actually cause the loss of much more lives of people than what you're seeing now, and that is why we cannot
Thank you,
take this
sir.
policy.
I don't understand how partition will cause a loss of lot more lives. As we have already shown you, our policy consists of a group of people from the US as well as the leaders from all these factions who will put in their best interest for the three nations. The mere fact that leaders from the political parties of all these three groups will come together to form a compromise. Yes, they will have to give up some things, and compromises are always there in negotiations, which we cannot deny. So, since we know that there will be leaders representing all these three communities coming together to take a decision for the community as a whole. We realize that it will be for the better of the whole nation as a whole. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, the strength of our policy as a whole. We have shown you that Iraq as a whole is in a state of utmost violence. It is existing in a state of anarchy where lives are being lost every day. What has the opposition done about it? Yes, they have many problems with the policy of the proposition, which we have already shown are non-existent, or even if existent to a very small extent compared to the status quo. But what has the opposition done about it? Yes, they say there are so many problems that will exacerbate the violence and it will not lead to any benefit. But what are they willing to do about it? Just watch the lives being lost? Just watch them engrossed in the violence? So ladies and gentlemen, I as the third proposition speaker say, go with this side of the house. Thank you.
I think that what they would like to say very much today is that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Tragically speaking, in the case of Iraq, absence is going to make the heart grow harder. And let me show you why this is so in my three contentions. But before that, let me show you the things that they ignored from our side today. They failed to tackle our concept of the regional theatre of war, where regional powers are going to interfere in the Iraqi conflict if the states are divided along with religious lines as they claim. And then in their third speaker, they even tried to concede that there were problems in their policy, and yet they couldn't even show us the solutions to the problems that they admitted existed in their policy. So, having dealt with that, let me move on to my three contentions for today. Let's begin first with the idea of their policy, secondly on the concept of social stability, and thirdly on economic stability. But let's begin with the policy. Now, today they talked about a UN presence there to facilitate the division of Iraq and to prevent the conflict from breaking out. They've clearly failed to realize that allowing the UN there, allowing 16 new nations to enter the conflict now, is clearly an infringement of Iraqi sovereignty. Already we are seeing great resentment in Iraq because of the American occupation there. We are bringing in a whole host of new nations, foreigners who from distant lands into Iraq is going to lead to far more resentment on the part of the Iraqi people who are going to be less likely to cooperate with the UN soldiers. In addition, the UN itself is incapable of trying to protect these states from each other. Why? We have seen before numerous conflicts before Iraq alone of how the UN has failed to prevent warring states or warring individuals and groups from attacking each other. We saw it in Srebrenica in 1985. We saw it in Rwanda in 1984. Various ethnic groups not prevented from killing each other. And what we saw was a clear, tragic loss of life. 800,000 people died in Rwanda alone, and the number will be far greater in a country as large as Iraq. No, thank you, sir. Next, then we want to the idea that we can somehow separate the resource on a proportional basis, so that every single region has resources that are applicable to them. They conceded, however, that resources can't really be divided along such lines. Because clearly we can't move oil fields, we can't move mines, we can't move facilities that already established there for years. Why? Because simply put, you can't move the oil fields from one region to another. It's a simple logical sense. The only way to do that is to transfer the oil via either a UN convoy or to send it directly by themselves. And what this is going to lead is to far more resentment because the states already don't like each other as they admitted. And because they don't like each other, what willingness is there on the states to deliver the oil on time, promptly, so as not to breed resentment? The point here is because of the unwillingness of each state to share out their resources, clearly the dialogue that they're calling today will definitely fall out. Already, as my second speaker mentioned, these states are already hating each other to the core. They are hating each other to the point where they're unwilling to share, unwilling to compromise, and therefore this system is definitely going to fail. But when they talk of proportional division, they also fail to realize that it is the Sunnis and the Kurds who are going to be angry at the idea of proportional division of the resources. Why? Because in dividing proportionally, it is clearly the Shiites who are the majority of Iraq who are going to get the most resources. And as such, the Sunnis and the Kurds who feel that they are getting their fair share of the oil and the other resources are definitely going to complain, they're definitely going to lead to extra tensions and clearly later on to more tension and war. So therefore, in this case, their point falls. And then they brought the example of somehow North Korea being sent resources by South Korea. I clearly fail to see the link here because these two take place on clearly different areas and clearly different regions and clearly different wars. Why? Let's look at the conditions in North and South Korea today. South Korea today still lives in the shadow of North Korea's acquired nuclear bombs. And as such, it is under pressure by North Korea to deliver their resources to them. And don't forget that the tension that existed in Korea is far lesser than that existing in Iraq today. Thanks to Saddam's repression, Kurds and Shiites all hate the Kurds and Sunnis, all hate the Shiites. And therefore the tension they're looking at in Korea is far less than anything that exists today in Iraq. Then thirdly, they talked about militants somehow gaining weapons across Iraqi borders. The point here is, if they're choosing to divide Iraq this way, we have lesser troops patrolling each border. And if lesser troops patrolling each border, how can we prevent the influx of weapons to support the terrorists within Iraq itself already? And in fact, how are we going to deal with the militants that exist all over Iraq now with weakened division armies all over the country? It's clearly impossible then to prevent Iraq from descending into what may become a terrorist state in future, and therefore their case falls here. Let me now go to my second contention on the idea of social stability. Now, in the other speaker, they brought a last-minute rebuttal on how to reduce the insurgency and terrorism that already exists today in Iraq. But what they failed to realize is that terrorists don't go away overnight. Simply partitioning Iraq doesn't mean that the terrorists and the insurgents are going to go away. What this does is they're going to turn attention to the new partition states where their hated religious religion is, and they're going to attack those states with bombs and other forms of suicide bombs. Don't you agree, sir?
Because clearly what we see is that insurgency has taken place in areas where the minority is being suppressed by the majority. So if you put them apart in different regions, this will clearly decrease the length of this insurgency.
Sir, clearly you're quite naive today because the terrorists don't just stay in one place forever. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, for example, in Iraq move from region to region, causing violence and spreading chaos in their wake. And therefore, even if you partition these states along these lines, the borders which are now lesser guarded by fewer troops are now more susceptible to allowing terrorists to slip through. But what is worse is that these terrorists will continue to attack the minorities that exist within each new separate state. And what is worse, they're going to attack sympathizers who feel that they should reconcile with other neighboring states as well. And therefore, because of this problem, the insurgency clearly isn't reducing anyway. Then their second speaker, they say that there is representation for repressed minorities like the Kurds when they have a new state of their own. But this really isn't true, because in the first place, what they're looking at now is entertaining the idea that politics in Iraq should now be based along religious and racial lines. This is a bad direction for Iraq to step into, because if allowing Iraq to step along the line of religious politics will only lead to more radicalism and more extremism and more fundamentalism. And when you read such tensions within the country itself, without any opposition voice from another race, another religion, you're going to lead these countries to become more aggressive to their new neighboring states, and as such lead to a future civil war, which they are claiming will predict happen in our case, but we show that it will happen in their case only. Next, then they claim today that we need to keep the conflicting groups apart for a cool-down period, as they claim. But clearly it doesn't work. Why? Because as my first speaker mentioned to you earlier, it's impossible to completely segregate all the races from each other, all the religions from each other. It's clearly impossible to separate them apart. And as such, minorities are going to exist, whether they like it or not, in each of the individual states. And as such, but what they fail to realize is that the tensions here are not resolved. The tensions here still exist because what they're doing is clearly artificially separating these religions along artificial lines themselves. And thus, without any means of solving the tension, without any dialogue to solve the religious tension, history of violence between these races, they can never find a way to resolve the conflict, and thus, we will see more conflict in the time to come. Then we now move on to my final contention on economic stability. They talked to us today about how the economy is currently unstable, and as such, we need to partition Iraq in order to ensure that stability exists. Now, already the situation of tension and potential warfare already exists in Iraq. But what is going to happen is that its powers, in their case, as we mentioned earlier, and as such, will any investor come to a country which is now fraught by tension, by war, and by a possible conflict that may break out in the near future, as is already shown. As such, if there is no prospect of any investors coming in, it's clearly because in their case, I'm talking about 3 separate states with disparate resources and tensions rising every single day. And as such, we have shown clearly that economic stability cannot result from simply partitioning the country. What is needed is a long-term policy of trying to build the country's resources back up and allow them to cooperate on the division of resources among themselves in a united Iraq in order to ensure that investors will come in. So having done my rebuttals today, let me show you what my side has proven already. We've shown you how, by dividing Iraq, you're exacerbating existing racial and religious tensions. We've shown you how there's a large disparity between the separate states that already exist. We've shown you how they're creating a regional theatre of war, and how they're spurring more terrorism and extremism. And as such today, ladies and gentlemen, absence doesn't make the heart grow any fonder. So let's reunite Iraq and make them learn to love each other more.
Rightly so. Where is the love? And that is exactly the problem the proposition has. There is no love on their side. We want a unified Iraq, free of all the grievances and the wounds. And we will show you that our side of the house has helped achieve that aim in my 2 questions. Firstly, what is best for Iraqis as a whole? Secondly, what is best for the region and the world as a whole? Firstly, let me deal with what is best for the Iraqis. They have come up by telling us about the status quo, how it is bad, and that is why we need a change. Whereas on our side of the house, we have shown you that the change that they are proposing, which is this policy, clearly has a lot of problems for the Iraqis themselves. Firstly, because there is terrorists still going to be there. Let us talk about the point of terrorists first. They told us that if we actually separate these states, there will not be any more terrorists and extremism. But we have shown you that how terrorists are not a particular organization which stays at one place. In fact, terrorists are stateless. They move from one place to another, creating a lot of violence there, and therefore their point on terrorists falls. Secondly, we had also shown you about the minorities. They talked about how these minorities will be protected if we separate the states. We have shown you by their policy it is actually impossible and impractical in actually separating the minorities from each other, and it is completely impossible to achieve complete racial separation because the minorities will still exist. Now, even if we consider that their policy goes perfectly well, our side of the house has also shown you that the problems will only be exacerbated because now we are creating three essential rival states against each other, which will continuously be involved in border conflicts, conflicts over resources, conflicts that will kill a large number of people. And therefore their reply to that was nothing, and they conceded on that side of the house that yes, these problems exist, but let us look at the status quo. But that is not the focus of today's debate. Our focus is to show that how this policy will not work. And because on grounds of how it fails on the Iraqis, we have shown you that this policy does not work. Therefore, we have already won the debate in that case. Now let's move on to the second question. What is better for the region? I had told you, as the first speaker, had told you that there is going to be a tremendous amount of regional instability because now three sovereign states are created in a war-stricken area of the Middle East in which they will be continuously fighting. Whereas my second speaker backed that up by saying that other countries will now have an easier way of attacking these nations, with Iran supporting the Shiite state and Saudi Arabia supporting the Sunnis. They had no real reply to that, showing us the status quo today and how the problem exists in Iraq. And this is not a solution to the problem that we had proposed. This is not countering the problems that this partition will cause. In fact, we only say that the partition will exacerbate the problem, the partition will cause more loss of lives, and therefore this point cannot stand. Next, we talk about the issue of how there will be economic stability. There was an entire issue raised that people will now be able to allocate resources proportionally and how this would solve all the problems. However, this is a problem that we've shown you because once there's proportional allocation of resources, firstly, it is impossible to do so because it's geographically not possible. Secondly, even if it was possible, the Shiites would now get the majority of the resources, clearly causing resentment among the Sunnis and the Kurds. And this is again a problem that the partition causes, and therefore we cannot support this. Therefore, on the whole, in this debate, we've shown you what is better in the short term as well as what is better in the long term. We have shown you what is better in the practical aspect as well as in the principal aspect. And because of all these reasons, because we answered these questions, what is better for the Iraqis and what is better for the nations more, we understand this idea of Iraq much better, and that is why this motion was formed.
Essentially, which side of the house is doing something about this problem to tackle it at its root, and we tell you the proposition is doing that well. Now, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the point today where we take a step back and view the main points of contention. Firstly, on that of exacerbation of the status quo, and secondly, on that of feasibility. Members of the House, just because of the perceived threats and problems that we assume or we perceive to be, that should not leave us in a passive stand by actually sitting down and watching millions of Iraqis and millions of innocent people being killed every day. We tell you that should not be the way. As my first speaker has already mentioned, the problem in status quo is drastic, ladies and gentlemen, and unless we do something about it immediately, we are not going to get anywhere. Now, firstly, what we have shown you is that through partition, we will be actually solving this problem at its root, because what we have shown you is that the nature of the status quo is such where people are not standing beside of one another. We see the Sunnis killing the Shiites and vice versa. We tell you by partitioning these states, there will be a lesser harm for these innocent victims who are killed every day, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why our policy is beneficial on both an individual level and, as my team has also showed you, on a national level. Now, firstly, they came up and told us how by partitioning these states, we are not exactly, there will still be tension amongst them. But what we have shown you, ladies and gentlemen, it will be moving, the owners of the proposition today is not to propose an utopian ideal. What we are doing is a progressive step that can actually basically do something about status quo to alleviate the suffering of these Iraqis currently. And we tell you this can only be done through our policy, because what the opposition is telling us, ladies and gentlemen, is no, your policy is not going to work because of ABC, and because of this factors, ladies and gentlemen, we should not do anything, but rather what we should do, or rather, we should let them feel the love, ladies and gentlemen. Let them feel the love of killing each other every single day. And we tell you that is what has been going on. Clearly, they have not been exactly feeling the love, as the opposition puts it, but what we are showing you is about time we segregate them, ladies and gentlemen. That would be the most practical approach as to what the opposition says, or what they have put out to be a very idealistic approach. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on that of feasibility, what we have shown you that our policy is indeed feasible, because firstly, what we are doing is that by actually having a body to sit down or having representatives from these three states to have diplomatic talks, we are tackling the issue at its roots. Because what we are doing is we're getting 3 people from these 3 sovereign states to actually come down and to have diplomatic talks about proportional allocation of revenue and resources. And we tell you this would actually solve the problem. Because at the end of the day, they also came up and told us about how the United Nations is not feasible and henceforth, but what we have shown you, that there will be a body that will actually make effective decisions with the best interests of these 3 nations at heart. And we tell you this would be the best way to go. However, ladies and gentlemen, what we saw was a very disillusioned and idealistic opposition who came up and basically proposed nothing, ladies and gentlemen. What they did was they just poked holes at our case without actually substantiating theirs. And we tell you, it is through our policy that we can see that will actually bring about benefits to Iraq, as the opposition puts it. Because at the end of the day, what is best for Iraq? And we tell you only through our policy will you see benefits, as I have mentioned earlier, social stability and both economic stability for these 3 sovereign states, both of which, ladies and gentlemen, was not tackled by the opposition today. So I suppose those who prompt actually stand. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have shown you is how our policy is more beneficial to the Iraqis simply because it tackles the root of this problem. Because what we are seeing, or as I mentioned earlier, I would like to re-emphasize that the proposition is not pushing for a utopic ideal, but what we are taking, ladies and gentlemen, is the first progressive step, and we tell you this is more crucial than taking none at all. And we tell you because of the various benefits that can actually arise through such a policy, go with my side of the house. Thank you.